The year is 2010. In the cavernous, climate-controlled silence of the Chicago Central Library's historical archives, a single pool of light illuminates a massive table. Liam Callahan, a young civil engineer with a sharp mind and an even sharper eye for detail, leans over a set of original blueprints. The air is thick with the scent of aging paper and binding glue, a perfume for history lovers. He was here to assess a simple moisture problem, a routine structural survey. His finger, however, traces a line on the yellowed vellum that makes his blood run cold. It's a line that shouldn't be there, a calculation that defies logic. For an architect of Arthur Vance's genius, it was more than an error. It was an impossibility. The flaw was nestled in the plans for the archive wing's western load-bearing wall, a section of the building renowned for its structural integrity. According to Vance's own meticulous notes and calculations on every other page, the wall should have been solid, a dense matrix of steel and reinforced concrete. Yet, this single sheet, dated from the final phase of construction in 1998, showed a discrepancy. A void, an unaccounted-for space, cleverly hidden behind the location for a permanent, floor-to-ceiling iron bookshelf. The math was deliberately, elegantly wrong. It was a purposeful imperfection in a building celebrated for its perfection, a silent scream of miscalculation that no one had noticed for 11 long years. Liam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the archive's regulated temperature. He was a devout admirer of Arthur Vance, having studied his work extensively in college. Vance was a purist, a man who believed that buildings were living things and that their bones, the structure, must be honest. This blueprint was a betrayal of that philosophy. It was a lie written in architectural language. Liam's mind raced, recalculating the load distributions, the stress tolerances. The dead space served no purpose. It weakened the wall, however, slightly. It was a puzzle box embedded in the heart of the library, and the blueprint in front of him was the key. The image on the blueprint dissolved, replaced by the flickering glow of an old television screen. The date stamp read January 1999. A news anchor, with the somber professionalism of the era, announced the sudden and baffling disappearance of Arthur Vance. His car, a modest sedan, was found abandoned at a downtown train station, keys in the ignition. The official police theory was simple and clean. He had walked away from his life. He had a ticket for a train he never boarded. The story was a 9-day wonder, a brief, sensational headline that quickly faded, leaving behind only the ghost of a question mark and a family shattered by uncertainty. In a grainy news clip from that time, a much younger woman stood on the steps of her family home, her face pale but defiant. Eleanor Vance, then in her early 20s, spoke to the reporters, her voice trembling but firm. She insisted her father would never leave them. He loved his work, he loved his family. But he had been different in the final months, she admitted. Quieter, more withdrawn, as if carrying a weight he couldn't share. She spoke of his integrity, his almost religious devotion to truth, and how that devotion seemed to be troubling him deeply. Her words painted a picture not of a man running away, but of a man trapped. Back in 2010, the silence of the archive felt heavier to Liam. The ghost of Arthur Vance was no longer just a historical figure. He was a presence in the room, his voice echoing from the flawed lines on the page. The magnificent library, Vance's crowning achievement, now seemed like a tomb. Not a tomb for a body, perhaps, but for a secret. The building itself, with its soaring atriums and quiet reading nooks, held its breath, waiting for someone to finally understand the story it was built to tell. The moisture problem in the wall seemed like a triviality now, a symptom of a much deeper, more sinister issue. Liam's initial mission was mundane: prepare a report, suggest some modern waterproofing solutions, and move on to the next project. It was a good contract for a rising engineer. But this discovery had changed the very nature of his job. To ignore this flaw would be a professional failure. It would be like a doctor ignoring a shadow on an X-ray. He felt a sudden, profound connection to the vanished architect, a man he had never met but whose mind he was now trying to decipher. This was more than a job. It had become a duty, a responsibility to the truth that Vance had so carefully hidden. The blueprint itself felt like a sacred artifact. It was drafted on heavy vellum, the lines drawn with a steady, confident hand, each letter and number placed with an artist's precision. This was from the cusp of the digital age, a relic of a time when architecture was a more tactile, personal craft. Liam could almost feel Vance's presence as he ran his hand over the slightly raised ink. The flaw was a deliberate dissonance, a single, sour note in an otherwise perfect composition. It was designed to be found, but only by someone who was looking closely enough, someone who understood the language of structure and stress. He carefully rolled the precious document, the crinkle of the old paper echoing in the stillness. The low hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to whisper a name, a warning. His simple renovation project was over before it had even begun. Now a different kind of project was taking shape in his mind, one of deconstruction rather than repair. He had to know what Arthur Vance had hidden inside the walls of his own masterpiece. He had to understand why a man dedicated to perfection would leave behind a single glaring flaw. It was a message in a bottle, and after 11 years it had finally washed ashore. A tremor ran through Liam's hands, a current of adrenaline and disbelief. It wasn't the cold of the archives, it was the chilling realization of what he was holding. The blueprint was no longer an inert historical document, it was alive. It was a confession etched in ink, a final, desperate message from a man who had vanished into thin air. He felt like an archaeologist who had just brushed the dust off a hidden inscription, revealing a truth that would rewrite history. The air grew thin, and his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. He was standing at the edge of a precipice, and the ground beneath his feet, once solid with professional certainty, had just crumbled away, revealing a dark, 11-year-old abyss. His mind, usually a precise instrument of calculation and logic, was now a storm of questions. Why would Arthur Vance, a purist of structural integrity, deliberately design a flaw? It was a calculated risk, a weakness introduced into the very heart of his masterpiece. This wasn't a mistake. It was an intentional act of sabotage against his own creation. It was a signpost. Vance hadn't just disappeared. He had left behind a map, a single cryptic clue that pointed to a secret he could not speak aloud. Liam understood with a terrifying clarity that Vance had built his final testament not with words, but with steel and concrete, trusting that one day someone with the right eyes would come along to read it. Liam looked up from the table, his gaze sweeping across the vast, silent room. The library, a building he had long admired for its grace and strength, suddenly seemed menacing. Its soaring arches and grand halls felt less like a sanctuary of knowledge and more like a beautifully constructed tomb. Every shadow seemed to stretch and deepen, hiding secrets within its folds. The low, constant hum of the climate control system was no longer background noise. It was the building breathing, holding its breath, waiting. He felt an unnerving sense of being watched, not by a person, but by the very structure around him, a silent witness that had kept its counsel for more than a decade, waiting for this exact moment. The protocol was clear: document the structural anomaly, report it to the city's Public Works Department, and recommend a course of action. But a standard report felt like a betrayal. How could he reduce this elegant, chilling puzzle to a few lines of bureaucratic jargon? Structural inconsistency found in West Wall, Section 4B. It was wholly inadequate, a lie of omission. He knew what would happen. They would send a team, inject some epoxy, reinforce the wall, and the secret would be entombed forever under a fresh layer of plaster and paint. The thought of it made him physically ill. He couldn't let Vance's message be silenced by indifference and red tape. The face of Eleanor Vance, frozen in time on that grainy 1999 news report, materialized in his thoughts. He remembered her fierce loyalty, her adamant refusal to believe her father had simply walked away. "He would never leave us. she had said, her voice a mixture of anguish and conviction. For 11 years she had lived with the torment of not knowing. Liam felt a powerful, unexpected connection to her, a stranger bound to him by this yellowed sheet of vellum. This discovery wasn't just about solving an architectural riddle. It was about the possibility of giving a daughter the answer she had been denied for so long. The stakes had shifted from professional to profoundly personal. He instinctively reached for his phone, then stopped, his thumb hovering over the screen. Who could he possibly tell? His boss would think he was overreacting, chasing ghosts in the archives. The police would laugh him out of the precinct for trying to reopen a cold case based on a hunch about a blueprint. He was utterly alone with this discovery, a solitary custodian of a secret that had been passed to him across the years. The weight of it was immense, a physical burden pressing down on his shoulders. Arthur Vance had thrown a message in a bottle into the ocean of time, and Liam Callahan was the one who had just found it washed ashore. A powerful certainty began to solidify amidst the chaos in his mind. He knew, with an instinct that transcended engineering principles, that the answer to Arthur Vance's disappearance was physically located inside that wall. The void shown on the blueprint wasn't just dead space, it was a container. It held the truth. It was a time capsule, a safe deposit box hidden in the most audacious way imaginable. His professional curiosity had now ignited into a burning obsession. He had to see what was inside. He had to know why a man would go to such lengths, risking his reputation and legacy, to hide something within the bones of his greatest achievement. He began to formulate a new plan, a careful strategy of manipulation. He wouldn't report a mere flaw. He would draft a report filled with alarming technical language, citing significant load-bearing discrepancies and unaccounted-for stress variables that posed a potential, albeit long-term, risk to the archive's integrity. He would use the system's own language to force it to act, to demand a physical, invasive inspection. It was a dangerous gamble. If he was wrong, if the void was nothing more than a construction anomaly, his credibility would be shattered. He would be the engineer who cried wolf, his career forever marked by this expensive and embarrassing folly. The sheer genius of Vance's plan was staggering. He didn't bury his secret in a remote location. He encased it within a public monument, a building that was a symbol of civic pride and transparency. It was the ultimate paradox, hiding a dark truth within a temple of enlightenment. The secret was protected by its own visibility, shielded by the assumption that no one would ever think to look for a flaw in a masterpiece. Vance had counted on the world's complacency, on the certainty that his work was perfect, and he had been right for 11 years. Liam felt a shiver of awe mixed with a deep sense of foreboding. He was now part of that plan. With meticulous care, Liam rolled the blueprint and slid it back into its protective cardboard tube. The crinkling of the old paper sounded like a whisper in the silent room. The document felt heavy in his hands, imbued with the weight of a man's life and the burden of a long-held secret. The mundane moisture problem that had brought him to this hallowed space now seemed like a distant, trivial memory, a simple key that had unlocked a door to a much larger, darker, and more complex reality. He was no longer just a civil engineer. He had become the unlikely heir to Arthur Vance's last and most important design. As he walked out of the archives and into the library's main rotunda, the world looked different. The afternoon light slanting through the high windows seemed to illuminate dust motes, dancing with untold stories. The faces of patrons buried in books seemed oblivious to the drama sealed within the very walls that sheltered them. Liam looked up at the intricate steel beams crisscrossing the ceiling, at the solid columns anchoring the structure to the earth. He was no longer seeing a building. He was seeing a tomb, a puzzle, and a promise. His simple renovation contract was over. A far more perilous and important project had just begun. But this was just the beginning of what was to come, and honestly, it makes you wonder, what would you do in a situation like this? You go to work for a routine job, and suddenly you're holding a secret that could rewrite history and put you in danger. Would you have the courage to pursue it? Let me know in the comments what you would do, and tell me where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, so if you're hooked on this mystery, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. You think you could handle the pressure Liam is about to face? Before the flaw, there was the man. Arthur Vance was more than an architect. In the Chicago of the late 1990s, he was a secular saint of steel and glass. His philosophy was one of structural honesty, a belief that a building's soul resided in its bones. He was meticulous, a perfectionist whose blueprints were considered works of art in their own right. His crowning achievement, the Chicago Central Library, completed in 1998, was hailed as a masterpiece of modern design. It was a soaring cathedral of knowledge, and Vance was its celebrated creator. He was a quiet, reserved man who let his work speak for him, and it spoke of integrity, strength, and an unwavering commitment to the truth of materials. His reputation was as solid as the foundations he designed. At the heart of his private world was his daughter Eleanor. In 1999, at 22, she was on the cusp of her own life, yet she remained her father's most devoted admirer. Their bond was forged not just in familial love, but in a shared appreciation for detail and beauty. She remembered evenings spent watching him sketch at the drafting table, the scent of graphite and paper filling their home. He would explain the physics of a cantilevered beam with the same passion a poet would use to describe a verse. To her, he wasn't the public icon. He was the man who taught her to see the world as a series of elegant, solvable problems. Her father was a man of principles, a man who believed in order and reason above all else, a belief she inherited and held on to fiercely. The public face of the library project was Mayor Richard Sterling, a charismatic and politically savvy leader who saw the library as his legacy. He and Arthur Vance were an odd but effective pair, often photographed together at the construction site, poring over plans. Sterling was the showman, securing funding and selling the grand vision to the public, while Vance was the quiet genius bringing it to life. To the city, they were the architects of a new cultural era. But behind the handshakes and groundbreaking ceremonies, a subtle friction existed. Sterling was a man of compromise and expediency, while Vance was an absolutist. Mr. Peterson, the head librarian who had been there since the beginning, would later recall the tense, closed-door meetings during the final construction phases, hushed arguments that never reached the press. In the final months of 1998, as the library prepared for its grand opening, a shadow fell over Arthur Vance. The public acclaim seemed to make him recede further into himself. Eleanor watched as her father grew distant, his usual creative energy replaced by a quiet, gnawing anxiety. He spent countless nights at the site, long after the construction crews had gone home, obsessively reviewing every detail. He would return in the small hours of the morning, smelling of concrete dust and cold night air, his face etched with a worry he refused to name. He dismissed her concerns, saying he was just ensuring his legacy was perfect. But Eleanor sensed it was something more, a weight so heavy that it was beginning to bend the strongest man she knew. January 1999 arrived with a brutal Chicago winter, and with it, the vanishing. One morning, Arthur Vance was simply gone. His bed was made, his coffee cup was in the sink, and his car, a modest sedan, was found parked at a downtown train station. Inside, the keys were in the ignition, and a one-way ticket to a destination with no known connections lay on the passenger seat. The official narrative formed quickly and cleanly. A brilliant man, cracking under the immense pressure of his success, had walked away from it all. The media painted a tragic portrait of a creative genius overwhelmed by his own creation. It was a simple, digestible story that required no further questions, allowing the city to celebrate its new library without the stain of a darker mystery. The official investigation was brief and perfunctory. Detective Kowalski, then a mid-career officer, was assigned the case. He remembered the feeling of hitting invisible walls at every turn. Every inquiry was gently but firmly redirected. The message from the top, delivered through his superiors, was clear. This was a personal matter, not a criminal one. Don't dig too deep. Don't disrupt the mayor's triumphant narrative. The case was closed in a matter of weeks, filed away under voluntary disappearance. Kowalski, a cynical but thorough cop, never bought it. He kept a private file, a collection of loose ends and unanswered questions, a testament to a gut feeling that he had been ordered to ignore a lie that was far more convenient than the truth. 11 years later, in 2010, Liam Callahan was building his own reputation. He was a young, sharp civil engineer, a product of a new digital generation, but with an old-school reverence for the masters who came before him. Arthur Vance was one of his idols. Liam had studied Vance's work in college, marveling at the mathematical elegance and structural purity of his designs. He was ambitious, logical, and driven by a professional curiosity that bordered on obsession. He believed that buildings, like numbers, never lied. When his firm landed a routine contract to assess and repair a persistent moisture problem in the historical archives of the Chicago Central Library, Liam saw it as an honor, a chance to walk through the halls his hero had built and to work, in a small way, on a masterpiece. By 2010, the library had settled into its role as a beloved civic institution. It was a landmark, a constant and reassuring presence in the city's skyline. The initial fanfare had faded, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of daily life. Patrons came and went, books were checked out, and the building aged with a quiet dignity. The moisture issue in the archive wing was seen as nothing more than a minor annoyance, the kind of mundane maintenance required for any large structure. It was a simple technical problem requiring a simple technical solution. No one suspected that the dampness seeping through the concrete was a symptom of a much deeper sickness, or that the routine repair job was about to pry open a wound that had been sealed shut for over a decade. For over a decade, Eleanor Vance lived in a state of suspended animation, the official story of her father's disappearance a constant, grating insult to his memory. She never accepted the narrative of a man who simply walked away. The father she knew was a man of profound responsibility, a man whose love for his work was second only to his love for her. She had spent 11 years replaying their final conversations, searching for clues in his tired eyes and distracted replies. The police report, with its clean, simple conclusion, felt like a deliberate fiction. To the world, Arthur Vance was a tragic footnote in the history of his own greatest creation. To Eleanor, he was an unsolved case, a gaping wound that time refused to heal. She clung to the conviction that he hadn't abandoned them. He had been taken from them, and the truth was still waiting to be found, buried somewhere in the city he helped build. Meanwhile, the man who had championed the library project, former Mayor Richard Sterling, enjoyed a comfortable and respected retirement. In 2010, he was a celebrated elder statesman of Chicago politics, his legacy literally cast in the stone and steel of the city's skyline. The library was his crown jewel, a project he had pushed through with relentless charisma and political muscle. He often spoke of his partnership with Arthur Vance as a perfect synergy of vision and execution, conveniently omitting the friction that grew between them in the final year. Sterling was a master of narrative, and he had successfully crafted one where the library stood as a monument to his leadership, while the architect's strange disappearance was merely a sad, personal tragedy that had no bearing on the project's triumphant completion. His influence, though no longer official, still ran deep through the city's veins. Back in 1999, Detective Kowalski was the one tasked with untangling the initial threads of the case. He remembered the feeling distinctly. It was like pulling on a string that was deliberately cut every time he got close to something solid. The investigation into Arthur Vance's disappearance was strangely muted from the start. Key figures from the mayor's office and the primary construction firm were perpetually, quote, unavailable for comment. Financial records related to the library's final construction budget were slow to arrive and arrived heavily redacted. Kowalski, a cop who trusted his gut more than official memos, felt the unmistakable chill of a coordinated Stonewall. The message, never spoken but always understood, was to let it go. The case was officially closed in under 6 weeks, but for Kowalski, it remained a cold, hard lump of unfinished business in the pit of his stomach. The library itself aged with a quiet, imposing grace. By 2010, it was no longer a novelty but an institution, woven into the fabric of daily life for thousands of Chicagoans. Mr. Peterson, the head librarian, had been there since the beginning, a silent witness to its entire history. He remembered the nervous energy of the final construction days, the hushed arguments between Vance and the mayor's liaisons. He recalled Vance's solitary late-night inspections, how the architect would walk the empty halls like a ghost, his face a mask of profound worry. Over the years, Mr. Peterson had watched the building settle, its secrets sealed within its walls. The persistent moisture problem in the archives was, to him, just another sign of age, a mundane task for the maintenance budget, never suspecting it was the building's way of trying to weep out a long-held secret. The world of civil engineering in 2010 was increasingly digital, a realm of CAD software and complex computer modeling. Liam Callahan excelled in this world, but he retained a deep, almost romantic appreciation for the old ways. He admired architects like Arthur Vance, who drafted by hand, whose calculations were an extension of their own minds, not a processor. For Liam, structural integrity was a form of truth, and Vance was its greatest modern prophet. When his firm was awarded the contract for the library's archive renovation, Liam saw it as more than a job. It was a pilgrimage, a chance to walk in the footsteps of his hero, and to have an intimate dialogue with the structure itself. He prepared for the project with meticulous dedication, studying every available schematic and construction document, determined to honor Vance's original vision in his repairs. Eleanor, now 35, had built a life for herself, but it was a life constructed around a hollow core. She worked as a graphic designer, a profession that, like her father's, required a keen eye for detail and structure. Yet, she could never fully commit to the future, always feeling the pull of the unresolved past. Every few years she would file a new request to have her father's case reopened, only to be met with bureaucratic indifference. She kept a box of his personal effects, a few worn-out sketching pencils, his favorite T-square, and a collection of photographs. These objects were her only tangible connection to him, relics of a man the world seemed eager to forget. Her hope had not died, but it had calcified into a quiet, stubborn resolve to one day find the truth, no matter how long it took. The political climate of Chicago had changed in 11 years, but the shadows of old power structures remained. Richard Sterling's influence was still a potent force, his network of allies and protégés woven throughout the city's departments, including public works. The very department that would oversee Liam Callahan's renovation project was still staffed by people who owed their careers to the former mayor. It was an invisible web of loyalty and obligation, dormant but strong. Any action that threatened to cast a shadow on Sterling's legacy, especially one as significant as the Central Library, was bound to trigger a response. The system was designed not to uncover old truths, but to protect established narratives. Liam was walking into a field of hidden tripwires, completely unaware of the danger that lay just beneath the surface of his routine assignment. Thus, the stage was set. In one corner, a young, brilliant engineer, driven by a reverence for perfection, about to inspect the masterpiece of his idol. In another, a daughter who had never given up hope, nursing a private, decade-long quest for justice. And in the shadows, a retired politician whose legacy was inextricably linked to a secret he thought was permanently buried. All of these lives were on a collision course, set in motion by the slow, persistent seep of water into a basement wall. The Chicago Central Library stood silent, a magnificent repository of stories, holding its own story, the most important one of all, deep within its concrete heart, waiting for the right person to finally turn the page and read what was written there. Liam's official report was a masterpiece of calculated alarmism, written in the cold, dispassionate language of engineering. He meticulously detailed the, quote, unaccounted-for structural anomaly in the archive's western load-bearing wall, citing, quote, significant discrepancies between the final phase blueprint and standard load-bearing specifications. He used phrases like potential for long-term material fatigue and unquantifiable stress concentration, carefully avoiding any mention of a hidden room while painting a picture of a potential structural failure so complex and concerning that it demanded immediate, invasive investigation. He submitted the 12-page document, complete with stress diagrams and projected load calculations, to the Chicago Public Works Department. It was a Trojan horse, built of technical jargon, designed to bypass the very bureaucracy it was appealing to. His career was riding on this gamble, a calculated risk that felt as unstable as the wall he was describing. The response from the city was predictably sluggish, a wave of bureaucratic inertia. Liam was summoned to a drab, beige office to meet with a senior official, a man named Henderson, whose tired eyes had seen 1,000 such reports. Henderson scanned the document with a practiced air of skepticism, viewing Liam as just another ambitious young engineer trying to inflate a minor issue into a major project. He spoke of budgets, of the library's historical landmark status, of the disruption an invasive inspection would cause. "It's likely just a construction oversight, Callahan," he said dismissively, "a change made on site that never made it to the final draft." But Liam stood his ground, calmly and firmly reiterating the precision of Arthur Vance's work. This wasn't an oversight, he insisted. With Vance, nothing was accidental. His quiet, unshakable confidence began to chip away at the official's indifference. That night, unable to let the matter rest, Liam made a decision that crossed the line from professional duty to personal crusade. After hours of searching through online archives and public records, he found a phone number for Eleanor Vance. His thumb hovered over the call button for a full minute, the weight of his intrusion pressing on him. He was about to reopen a wound that had scarred over for 11 years, all based on a structural anomaly and a gut feeling. Taking a deep breath, he made the call. He introduced himself carefully, his voice steady as he explained his role at the library and the discrepancy he had found in her father's blueprints. He spoke not of a conspiracy, but of a puzzle, an architectural riddle left by a genius that he believed only she could help him solve by lending her voice to his cause. On the other end of the line, Eleanor Vance listened in stunned silence, her world tilting on its axis. Her small apartment, filled with the quiet hum of her life, suddenly felt charged with the electricity of the past. Over the years, she had received calls from psychics, conspiracy theorists, and reporters chasing a cold story. But this was different. Liam's language was technical, precise, and devoid of sensationalism. He spoke of load-bearing walls and stress calculations, the very vocabulary that had been the backdrop of her childhood. It resonated with the memory of her father's meticulous mind. A man like Arthur Vance would never make a mistake like the one Liam described. The flicker of hope she had guarded for so long, now a fragile ember, began to glow with a terrifying new heat. She agreed to meet him and support his request for an inspection. The city, faced with a formal request from the architect's daughter and Liam's unyielding technical report, finally relented. They approved a, quote, limited, non-destructive survey, with core sampling if necessary. On a cold Tuesday in November 2010, a small team assembled in the hushed quiet of the archives. The massive iron bookshelf had been carefully moved, revealing an expanse of bare, painted concrete. Liam stood with Eleanor, a silent pact of nervous energy between them. The city official, Henderson, watched with folded arms, his expression betraying his annoyance. Mr. Peterson, the librarian, hovered near the doorway, a ghost from the library's past witnessing a potential exorcism. The technicians set up their equipment, ground-penetrating radar and sonic scanners, the clinical hum of the machines, a stark contrast to the emotional weight that filled the room. The first results appeared on the small laptop screen, a series of green and black lines mapping the density of the wall. The technician running the GPR whistled softly. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, pointing to the screen. "Your boy was right. There, exactly where the blueprint had indicated the flaw, the radar showed a clear, geometrically perfect void. It was approximately 10 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and stretched from floor to ceiling. It wasn't a natural cavity or a simple flaw in the concrete pour. It was a space, deliberate, empty. Henderson stepped forward, his skepticism visibly melting away, replaced by a look of profound confusion. The data was irrefutable. The wall was hollow. The factual evidence had confirmed Liam's suspicion, transforming his theory from a wild guess into a chilling certainty. "We have authorization for core sampling," Liam stated, his voice tight. The decision was made. The high-pitched whine of a diamond-tipped core drill shattered the archive's silence, a sound that seemed to be cutting through time itself. Concrete dust, smelling of earth and secrets, filled the air. Eleanor held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped her hands together. After a few minutes of intense drilling, the sound changed. The bit punched through the final layer of concrete with a sudden, jarring lack of resistance. It was through. The technicians carefully retrieved the core sample and inserted a fiber-optic borescope into the newly created hole. On the laptop screen, a grainy black-and-white image flickered to life. It was not the expected view of insulation or rebar. It was the dark, dusty interior of a room, and in the center of the camera's narrow view sat a leather briefcase. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The technicians stared, dumbfounded. Henderson, the city official, simply shook his head in disbelief, muttering something under his breath. For Liam, it was a moment of terrifying vindication. His logic had led him here, to this impossible discovery. But for Eleanor, it was something else entirely. The sight of that briefcase, so familiar, so much like the one her father used to carry, was a physical blow. It was real, a secret room, sealed for 11 years, holding a piece of her father's last day. The questions that had haunted her for a decade suddenly coalesced into a single, terrifying point of focus. The puzzle was no longer theoretical. It was concrete and steel and dust and leather. The answer to her father's disappearance was on the other side of that wall. The order was given, sharp and immediate. The small hole from the borescope was no longer sufficient. They needed entry. A controlled demolition was authorized, a phrase that felt both technically accurate and emotionally inadequate for what was about to happen. A technician with a concrete saw began to trace a large rectangle on the wall, the high-pitched scream of the diamond blade echoing through the hallowed silence of the archives. Each cut sent a shower of sparks and a plume of fine, gray dust into the air, the smell of pulverized stone mingling with the scent of old paper. Eleanor watched, her body rigid, as the saw carved through the final barrier, separating her from a truth she had chased for 11 years. This wasn't just a wall being opened. It was a tomb, a time capsule, and the final chapter of her father's life being brutally, surgically exposed. The noise was deafening, a violation of the library's sacred quiet, but the silence of anticipation in the room was even louder. With a final groan of stressed rebar, the large concrete slab was carefully pried loose and moved aside, revealing a dark, gaping maw in the wall. A profound, chilling silence fell over the room, broken only by the hum of the work lights. The air that drifted out of the opening was cold, stale, and unnervingly still, carrying the scent of nothingness, of time trapped in a vacuum. It smelled ancient. For a moment, no one moved. They were all standing on the precipice of a discovery, frozen by the gravity of the moment. The dark rectangle was a portal not to another room, but to another time. It was January 1999, sealed and preserved. Liam Callahan, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze, knew he had to be the first to look. He was the one who had opened this door, and he would be the first to step through it. He took a high-powered flashlight and aimed its beam into the darkness. The space was small, no larger than a walk-in closet, and starkly empty, save for two objects. The leather briefcase sat in the center of the floor, exactly as they had seen it on the grainy borescope image, covered in a fine, uniform layer of dust. But now, the beam of light revealed something else, something that had been just out of the camera's view. Hanging from a single, simple hook, drilled into the far concrete wall, was a dark wool coat. It was perfectly preserved, its shoulders slightly slumped as if the wearer had just taken it off. The dust motes, disturbed by the sudden change in air pressure, danced in the flashlight beam like tiny, silent ghosts, swirling around the two solitary artifacts left behind by a man who had vanished from the world. From behind Liam, Eleanor let out a small, choked sound, a noise of such profound recognition that it cut through the clinical tension in the room. "That's his coat," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the coat he was wearing the last morning I saw him." The object, once just a piece of evidence, was instantly transformed into a sacred relic. It was a tangible piece of her last memory of her father, a direct, physical link to the man she had lost. The sight of it hanging there, so ordinary and yet so impossibly out of place, shattered her composure. Tears she had held back for over a decade began to stream down her face. The cold, empty room was no longer an architectural anomaly. It was the last place her father had stood. It was his final, silent goodbye, left waiting for her to find. Stepping carefully over the threshold, Liam entered the sealed space. His boots made no sound on the floor. The dust was so fine it seemed to absorb all noise. The air was frigid, and he could see his breath fog in the beam of his flashlight. He approached the briefcase, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a handsome, well-used satchel, the kind a professional of Vance's generation would carry. Near the brass clasp, he could just make out the faded, gold-leaf initials, AV. The confirmation sent another shiver down his spine. He resisted the urge to open it, knowing it was now evidence. He carefully lifted it, its weight feeling significant, and passed it out of the opening to a waiting forensics technician. Before he did, he noticed something else on the floor, tucked almost completely under the shadow of the hanging coat, something small and white. The forensic team, now working with a quiet, methodical urgency, began their preliminary analysis. They took air samples, confirming the atmosphere was low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide, consistent with a space sealed for a long period. They carefully collected dust samples from the floor, the briefcase, and the coat. An initial report, delivered in a hushed tone to Henderson, was stark. There was no sign of degradation, no biological material, and the dust patterns were completely undisturbed. "Whatever happened in here," the lead technician said, "happened once, a long time ago. No one has been in or out of this room since the day it was sealed." The scientific data painted a clear picture. This was not a crime scene in the traditional sense. It was a vault, a meticulously prepared time capsule designed to preserve its contents perfectly. Liam reached down and carefully picked up the white object he had spotted. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax. On the front, written in a steady, elegant hand that Liam recognized instantly from the blueprints, was a single name, Eleanor. He felt a jolt, a sudden understanding that this discovery was far more personal than he could have imagined. He turned, the envelope held carefully in his gloved hand, and walked back to the opening. He bypassed the officials and the technicians, his eyes finding only Eleanor's. "I believe this is for you," he said, his voice soft. He handed her the letter. The room, with all its officials and forensic experts, seemed to disappear, the universe shrinking to the space between Eleanor and the final message from her father. She took the envelope, her fingers tracing the letters of her own name, penned by a hand that had vanished 11 years ago. The paper felt cold, a relic from another era. She held in her hands the one thing she had craved for more than a decade, an explanation. The briefcase, now sitting on a sterile evidence table, promised to reveal the professional secret that had cost her father everything. The coat, hanging like a specter in the small, dark room, was the ghost of her last memory of him. But this letter, this was his voice, reaching across the chasm of time to speak directly to her. The mystery of what Arthur Vance had hidden was beginning to unravel, replaced by a far more profound and painful question. What had he been trying to say? The answer was now in her hands, waiting to be read. With trembling hands, Eleanor broke the wax seal on the envelope. The paper inside was thick and bore the familiar, precise handwriting of her father. The letter was not a confession or a suicide note, but a final, heartbreaking act of protection. He wrote of his love for her, of his pride in her, and then, in more guarded terms, of the terrible and deep-seated rot he had discovered within the library project. He explained that he couldn't go to the authorities because the corruption extended too far, implicating people so powerful they could make any evidence and any person disappear. He told her the briefcase contained his proof, a legacy of truth he was entrusting to the future. "Do not open it alone," he warned. "Find someone who believes in the integrity of numbers, because numbers cannot be intimidated. The truth is in the math." The letter was both a loving farewell and a strategic directive, a final blueprint for the justice he could not achieve himself. The atmosphere in the archive grew thick with anticipation as a forensic technician, following strict protocol, prepared to open the briefcase. The brass clasps, untouched for 11 years, clicked open with a sound that seemed to slice through the silence. Liam, Henderson, and Eleanor leaned in. There were no personal mementos, no architectural sketches. Instead, the briefcase was packed with a dispassionate, damning collection of evidence. On top lay several thick accounting ledgers, their columns filled with Vance's neat, disciplined script. Beneath them were dozens of carefully organized microfiche slides and, tucked into a side pocket, a single, hand-labeled microcassette tape. The discovery instantly reframed the entire narrative. This was not the tragic story of a man who ran away from his life. It was the meticulous chronicle of a man who had sacrificed his life to expose a crime. A forensic accountant was brought in, and under the glare of sterile work lights, the ledgers were opened. The contents were a methodical indictment of greed. Liam, with his engineer's eye for project costs, immediately recognized the pattern. There were invoices for tons of steel that were never delivered, payments to shell corporations for consulting services, and labor costs that were inflated by nearly 40%. Each fraudulent entry was cross-referenced and annotated by Vance. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and staggering in its scale. By their initial estimate, over $20 million had been systematically siphoned from the library's construction budget. The paper trail was undeniable, and many of the authorizing signatures belonged to a high-ranking official in then-Mayor Richard Sterling's administration. The rot Vance had written about had a name and a price tag. If the ledgers were the body of the crime, the microfiche slides were its soul. They contained photographic copies of offshore bank statements, internal memos from the construction firm, and, most damningly, copies of wire transfers moving city funds into private accounts. Arthur Vance had not just suspected a crime, he had gathered incontrovertible proof. It became chillingly clear how he had spent his final anxious months, not just designing a building, but conducting a clandestine investigation into the very people who were funding it. The name Richard Sterling was a ghost in the machine, never appearing as a direct recipient, but his office was the central hub from which all the fraudulent approvals originated. The conspiracy was not a simple kickback scheme. It was a complex web of corruption woven directly into the fabric of the city's government. Henderson, the city official who had been so dismissive just hours before, now looked like a man who had seen a ghost. He was visibly shaken, his face pale as he understood the political cataclysm they had just unearthed. Realizing the city's police department could be compromised by Sterling's lingering influence, he made a discreet call to a trusted contact in the Illinois State's Attorney's office. He spoke in low, urgent tones, bypassing the official city channels. The investigation was immediately elevated, taken out of the hands of the local authorities, and placed under state jurisdiction. The archive room was officially sealed, no longer just a structural anomaly but the heart of a major criminal investigation. Liam and Eleanor were no longer just a curious engineer and a grieving daughter. They were the state's star witnesses in a conspiracy that had lain dormant for over a decade. Despite the official secrecy, news of the discovery leaked. A single explosive headline appeared on the Chicago Tribune's website. "Secret Room in Library Reveals Clues in Architect's 1999 Disappearance." In his quiet, luxurious suburban home, Richard Sterling, now a revered elder statesman, read the headline on his tablet. The carefully constructed tranquility of his retirement shattered. For 11 years, he had believed the secret was sealed in concrete, as permanent as his legacy. He picked up his phone, his hand steady, despite the tremor of rage inside him. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years, and when a voice answered, he spoke only 7 words. The library. It's been opened. Fix it. Across the city, the dormant tendrils of an old and powerful political machine began to twitch back to life. The blowback was immediate and insidious. Liam was summoned by his firm and placed on indefinite paid leave, a clear signal for him to distance himself from the case. His work email was deactivated, his access to company servers revoked. That night, he received a call on his private cell from an unknown number. When he answered, all he heard was the faint sound of breathing before the line went dead. Simultaneously, a smear campaign began to brew online. Anonymous comments on engineering forums and news articles began questioning his credentials, suggesting he was a reckless glory seeker who had fabricated a conspiracy to make a name for himself. The message was brutally clear. He was being isolated, discredited, and warned. The forces Vance had feared were still very much alive, and now they were targeting him. Eleanor, holding her father's letter like a shield, knew they needed an ally who understood the enemy they were facing. She remembered the name of the original detective on her father's case from old news clippings, Detective Kowalski. She found him living in a small bungalow on the south side, retired and embittered. They met him at a local diner, the smell of stale coffee hanging in the air. As they laid out the contents of the briefcase, Kowalski's cynical facade cracked, replaced by a look of grim vindication. "I knew it," he muttered, slamming a fist lightly on the table. "They told me to stand down, said it was a family matter." He went home and returned with a dusty cardboard box filled with his own unofficial notes from 1999. Interviews he'd been ordered to forget, names of subcontractors who had been too scared to talk. He had been waiting 11 years for this conversation. Kowalski's old files provided the human context for Vance's cold, hard numbers. He detailed the political climate of the late 90s, when Sterling was treated like royalty, his power absolute. The main contractor implicated in the ledgers, Apex Construction, had declared a sudden bankruptcy just months after the library's completion, its owners vanishing with millions. Kowalski had always suspected a massive kickback scheme, but was stonewalled at every turn. Vance's evidence was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. He looked at Liam and Eleanor, his eyes hard with the memory of his own defeat. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "You haven't just found evidence of a crime. You've declared war on Richard Sterling's legacy. And that legacy has friends in very high places who will do anything to protect it." The final piece of evidence, the microcassette tape, was analyzed by the state's forensics lab. The audio was shockingly clear. It was a recording of a late-night meeting between Arthur Vance and Richard Sterling in Vance's on-site office, just weeks before he disappeared. Vance's voice was calm and steady as he confronted the mayor with the ledgers, appealing to his conscience. Sterling's response began with a dismissive laugh, which then curdled into pure menace. "You're a builder, Arthur, not a crusader," Sterling's voice snarled on the tape. "You have a beautiful daughter, a wonderful career. It would be a tragedy to see all of that fall apart over some misplaced idealism. Walk away. Let this go. Consider this building your final, perfect statement, and leave the rest to history." It was not a direct threat of violence, but a chilling promise of total annihilation. The tape was the smoking gun. It proved Sterling's direct knowledge, his motive, and his attempt to intimidate Vance into silence. The state's attorney began preparing to convene a grand jury, but Sterling's machine moved faster. Before charges could be filed, a prominent judge, a man Sterling had appointed to the bench 2 decades prior, issued a stunning and legally dubious injunction, citing anonymous complaints about Liam's unethical methods and procedural violations during the discovery. The judge ordered all evidence seized from the library to be sealed pending a full review. Just as the truth was about to break free, the system was being manipulated to lock it away again. Liam and Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps, watching their victory dissolve into a legal nightmare. They were no longer just fighting a ghost from the past. They were in an open war against a powerful enemy who was using the very laws of the city as his weapon. The judge's injunction landed like a physical blow, a legal garrote tightening around the neck of the truth. For Liam and Eleanor, the victory they had felt just hours before curdled into a cold, sickening dread. They had followed the rules, unearthed the evidence, and presented it to the proper authorities, only to watch the system itself bend to the will of a powerful ghost. The efficiency of it was the most chilling part. A single phone call from Richard Sterling had undone 11 years of waiting in a matter of hours. The ledgers, the tape, her father's final words. All of it was now locked away in an evidence vault, declared inadmissible by the very institution meant to champion justice. They were standing on the courthouse steps, not as victors, but as outcasts, holding a truth that was legally forbidden to be spoken aloud. The war had just begun, and they had already lost the first, most critical battle. Back in the smoky confines of a corner booth at the diner, Kowalski just shook his head, a grim, knowing look in his eyes. He wasn't surprised. He was vindicated in his cynicism. "This is how they play," he grumbled, stirring his black coffee. "They don't break the law, they buy it. They own the referees." He explained that a direct legal challenge to the injunction would be a slow death, a war of attrition they couldn't win against Sterling's bottomless resources and influence. Their only option was to find a new front. He opened his dusty box of files again, spreading the old, yellowed papers across the table. "Vance's evidence is frozen," he said, tapping a faded interview transcript. "But the people who were there, they're not. We need to find someone who was too scared to talk then, but is scared enough of their own conscience now." His finger landed on a name, Marcus Thorne, a junior accountant for Apex Construction. The search for Marcus Thorne felt like chasing a ghost. His official records vanished after Apex Construction dissolved in 1999. He had paid his taxes, then simply ceased to exist on paper. Liam, using his skills for meticulous research, spent days navigating a labyrinth of digital breadcrumbs and public records, while Kowalski worked old contacts on the force. They discovered Thorne had legally changed his name and moved twice, finally settling in a small, unassuming town in Wisconsin. He was living a quiet life as a high school math teacher. The journey to find him was fraught with a low-grade paranoia. Every car that seemed to linger behind them on the highway, every unfamiliar face in a rest stop, felt like a potential agent of Sterling's network. They were operating outside the law's protection now, a small band of conspirators fighting a much larger, more powerful conspiracy. They found Marcus Thorne raking leaves in his modest front yard, a man who looked haunted by a past he had tried to outrun. When they approached him and said the name Apex Construction, every ounce of color drained from his face. Initially, he was hostile, threatening to call the police, his panic palpable. He denied everything, his voice trembling. It was Eleanor who broke through his wall of fear. She didn't press him with facts or evidence. Instead, she sat with him on his porch steps and spoke of her father, of the man who loved numbers and believed in structural honesty. She showed him a copy of Arthur's letter. "My father died, protecting a truth you helped him find," she said softly. "His sacrifice can't be for nothing. Please, help me give it meaning." Her genuine grief and quiet strength reached a part of him that fear had not yet extinguished. Tears streamed down Thorne's face as decades of buried fear and guilt finally erupted. He confessed everything in a torrent of whispered words. He was a young accountant, ambitious but naive, when he was ordered to create a shadow ledger system for the library project. He detailed the intricate scheme of ghost employees, fraudulent material invoices, and kickbacks laundered through a dozen shell corporations. He confirmed that all roads led back to Mayor Sterling's chief of staff, who acted as the bagman. Then he revealed a far darker secret. Vance wasn't the only one, Thorne choked out. There was a city building inspector, a guy named O'Malley. He started asking too many questions about the steel orders. A month later, he had a tragic accident at a different construction site. We all knew what it meant. The name O'Malley hit Kowalski like a bolt of lightning. He remembered the case, a 1998 file that had been quickly closed. A supposedly freak accident involving faulty scaffolding. He had always had a bad feeling about it. Another loose thread in a city full of them. Now, it was connected. This wasn't just a story of embezzlement anymore. It was a conspiracy that included at least one potential murder. The stakes had been raised exponentially. If Sterling's network was willing to kill to protect their secret then, they would certainly be willing to do it now. The danger Liam and Eleanor were in was no longer theoretical. They were threatening to uncover not just a financial crime, but a capital one. The ghost of Richard Sterling was no longer just a powerful politician. He was a potential killer, and they were his primary targets. While they were in Wisconsin, Sterling's machine was moving silently back in Chicago. Mr. Peterson, the elderly head librarian who had corroborated Vance's late-night anxiety to the state's attorney, was visited by two men from the city's pension board. They presented him with an offer for an immediate early retirement, complete with a pension package so generous it was practically a bribe. The message was unspoken but crystal clear. Take the money, disappear quietly, and forget everything you saw. A week later, Mr. Peterson was gone, his office cleared out, replaced by a younger, more politically connected administrator. It was a masterful move of silent intimidation, removing a key witness from the board without a single overt threat, demonstrating the insidious, far-reaching power Sterling still wielded over the city's institutions. The threats soon became deeply personal. Eleanor returned to her apartment one evening to a feeling of profound unease. The door was locked, nothing appeared to be missing, but the air was different. Then she saw it. On her drafting table, where she kept her work, lay a single, broken sketching pencil. It was a specific brand, a soft-leaded graphite pencil her father had exclusively used, one of the few mementos she kept in a memory box in her closet. Someone had entered her home, ignored everything of monetary value, gone through her most personal belongings, and left a deliberately broken symbol of her father's legacy as a warning. It was an act of intimate terrorism, a message that screamed, "We can get to you. We can touch what you love. We can break you, just like we broke him." The violation left her shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying rage. Liam, meanwhile, faced an assault on a different front. The anonymous online smears against him coalesced into a formal ethics complaint filed with the Illinois State Board of Professional Engineers. The complaint, citing the judge's injunction as proof of his reckless and unprofessional conduct, called for a full review of his license. His firm, wanting to distance themselves from the controversy, formally terminated his employment, citing the ongoing investigation. In a matter of weeks, Liam went from being a rising star in his field to a professional pariah. It was a systematic campaign designed to utterly dismantle his credibility. If they succeeded, he would not only lose his career, but any testimony he gave in court would be rendered worthless, the ravings of a disgraced and discredited engineer. Seeing every official door being slammed shut, Kowalski decided it was time to change the rules of the game. He knew that while Sterling could control judges and city officials, he couldn't completely control the narrative if it broke free into the public domain. He contacted a journalist he trusted from his days on the force, a tenacious investigative reporter named Sarah Jenkins. He didn't give her the whole story, just a single, explosive breadcrumb from Marcus Thorne's confession, the name of the judge who issued the injunction, and a record showing that the judge's first judicial appointment 2 decades ago was personally signed off by then-Mayor Richard Sterling. It was circumstantial but deeply suspicious. The next day, a headline ran on the Tribune's front page. Judge in library case has deep political ties to former Mayor Sterling. The media leak was a lit match on dry tinder. Public scrutiny intensified, and the story of the sealed evidence began to gain traction. Emboldened by the shifting public opinion, and armed with Kowalski's corroborating file on the O'Malley case, the state's attorney's office found a narrow legal justification to challenge the injunction on the grounds of judicial conflict of interest. They moved quickly and quietly, issuing a secret grand jury subpoena for Marcus Thorne, planning to bring him to a safe house in Chicago. The plan was in motion, a desperate gambit to bring the truth to light. But as Liam and Eleanor waited for news of Thorne's arrival, Eleanor's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message contained only 5 words. "They found me. I'm sorry." Their star witness, the one man who could connect all the pieces, had just been silenced. The 5 words on Eleanor's screen landed with the crushing finality of a slammed door. "They found me. I'm sorry." The message was an epitaph for their hope, a digital tombstone for their only corroborating witness. The air in the diner booth, already thick with the smell of burnt coffee and stale grease, became suffocating. Liam felt a cold, hollow sensation spread through his chest, the feeling of a carefully constructed plan disintegrating into dust. Beside him, Eleanor didn't cry. Her grief had hardened into something far more dangerous, a diamond-hard point of rage. Kowalski simply stared at the phone, his expression unchanging, the grim, cynical mask of a man who'd expected this all along. He had seen this happen before. He knew that in a war against men like Sterling, the first casualties are always the ones who dare to speak the truth. They were completely and utterly alone. Kowalski took a long, slow sip of his cold coffee, the silence stretching between them. So the front doors closed and bolted. He finally grumbled, his voice a low rasp. "They've sealed the evidence, they've discredited you, and now they've silenced our witness. They think they've won." He leaned forward, his tired eyes glinting with a defiant spark. He reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out one last, dog-eared file folder. "But they don't know about the back alley." He opened it to reveal a single yellowed interview transcript from 1998. Marcus Thorne was the money guy. But the real danger to them was the man who understood the bones of the building. The city inspector, they said, had an atro accident. The man who was Arthur Vance's friend. A man named Patrick O'Malley. The name hung in the air, a ghost from a case Kowalski had been forced to abandon. Liam and Eleanor looked at him, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a flicker of desperate curiosity. "O'Malley was a straight arrow," Kowalski explained, his finger tracing a line in the transcript. "He was meticulous, just like Vance. They respected each other. He was raising hell about the steel orders for weeks before he fell. The official story was faulty scaffolding. I never bought it." He tapped a name on the page, a witness who was too terrified to give an official statement. His foreman, a guy named Sully O'Connell, was there that day. He saw something. He was a friend of O'Malley's. If there's one person left alive who knows what really happened, and whose conscience might be heavy enough to break, it's him. A new and perilous path opened before them. To seek out Sully O'Connell was to step completely outside the boundaries of the law, to become vigilantes in their own story. They would no longer be witnesses. They would be targets. Liam, the logical engineer, weighed the risks, his mind calculating the rapidly diminishing probability of survival. But then he looked at Eleanor. He saw the reflection of her father's unwavering integrity in her eyes, the same quiet strength that had led Arthur Vance to seal himself inside his own masterpiece. Her voice was steady, devoid of fear. "We have to find him," she said. "My father gave up his life to leave us a map. We can't stop now, not when we're this close to the end of it." In that moment, the decision was made. They were no longer fighting for justice. They were fighting to honor a sacrifice. The search for Sully O'Connell became a frantic race against an invisible clock. Using old Union records Kowalski had kept, They tracked him to a neighborhood nestled in the city's industrial gut, a place of rust and forgotten factories near the Calumet River. As they drove through the desolate streets under a sky the color of bruised steel, a black sedan seemed to shadow them for several blocks, a silent, menacing presence that peeled off only when they pulled into the crowded parking lot of a longshoreman's tavern. The place was called The Anchor, a dive bar that smelled of damp wool, fried fish, and decades of spilled whiskey. The air was thick with smoke and the low murmur of tired men. It was a place where secrets could be kept, but also where they could be violently buried. They knew Sterling's network would be sweeping up loose ends, and Sully was the last one. They found him in a dark corner booth, a ghost of a man with a face like a road map of regrets, nursing a glass of amber liquid. His eyes, pale and watery, flickered with recognition and fear as they approached. "I got nothing to say to you," he rasped, his voice rough from whiskey and disuse. "I saw you on the news. You need to leave. Now." He tried to wave them away, his hand trembling slightly. He was a man drowning in his own history, terrified of the ghosts they were trying to resurrect. He had seen firsthand what happened to men who crossed Richard Sterling. He had watched his friend Pat O'Malley pay the price, and he had spent the last 12 years praying that his silence had been enough to keep his own family safe. Their presence was a match struck in a room filled with gasoline, and he wanted no part of the inevitable explosion. Liam began to lay out the evidence, the ledgers, the numbers. But Sully just shook his head, his eyes squeezed shut. It was Eleanor who finally broke through the wall of his fear. She sat down opposite him, her hands resting calmly on the scarred wooden table. She didn't speak of evidence or conspiracies. She spoke of her father. She described the way he used to obsess over the honesty of a structure, how he believed a building had a soul. She slid a small, faded photograph across the table, a picture of Arthur Vance and Pat O'Malley, laughing together at the library's groundbreaking ceremony. "These were good men," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "They were men who believed in doing things the right way. Your friend died for it. My father disappeared for it. Their deaths can't be for nothing. Please, help us tell their story." The old man stared at the photograph, his tough facade crumbling like weathered concrete. A single tear traced a path through the deep lines on his cheek. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that was 12 years old. "It wasn't just the money," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It was the steel. Pat found it. They were using substandard I-beams in the sub-basement levels. Cheaper, weaker. From a non-certified supplier." He did the math. A catastrophic failure was unlikely, but under the right stress, a partial collapse, it would kill people. He took a ragged breath. It wasn't just theft. It was a tomb they were building, and my friend was going to expose them. That's why they killed him. It was never an accident. They killed him to protect a lie that was built into the very foundation of that library. The confession hung in the smoky air, a truth more horrifying than they could have imagined. This was the rot Arthur Vance had discovered, a crime not just against the city's finances, but against its very people. A ticking time bomb of faulty steel hidden beneath a temple of knowledge. "I was there," Sully choked out, the words tumbling out of him now, a torrent of guilt. "At another site. They called us over. Sterling's chief of staff, a man named Costello, he was there. He and O'Malley were arguing up on the scaffolding. There was a shove. Pat, he just went over. Costello looked right at me. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. The next day, someone left a picture of my daughter on the windshield of my car. I understood. The conspiracy wasn't just about cover-ups. It was rooted in cold-blooded murder." Sully leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a desperate need to unburden himself. Pat knew they were onto him. He was paranoid, but he was smart, he said, his eyes darting toward the door. He kept a logbook, a little black one. He wrote everything down. The beam serial numbers, the fraudulent inspection reports, dates, times, everything. He told me, "If they get me, Sully, the truth is in the book. Mary has it. She just doesn't know what it is." He gave it to his wife for safekeeping, disguised as an old journal. They had it. A new target. A new piece of physical evidence, untouched by Sterling's legal machinations. A book that contained the truth of a murder, written in the victim's own hand. It was the key, the one thing, that could bring the entire corrupt structure crashing down. Just as this new hope ignited, the heavy front door of the tavern swung open, casting long, menacing shadows into the room. Two men, broad-shouldered and dressed in dark, immaculate suits that were starkly out of place among the working-class patrons, stepped inside. They didn't order drinks. Their eyes, cold and predatory, swept the room, methodically scanning each booth. They moved with an unnatural stillness, an air of authority that chilled the bar's boisterous atmosphere. Sully froze, the color draining from his face, a choked sound catching in his throat. "It's them," he whispered, his body rigid with terror. Costello's men. The hunters had found their prey. The abstract threat of a powerful network had just materialized into a physical, immediate danger. There was nowhere left to run. In a split second, Kowalski's years of training kicked in. He was no longer a retired detective. He was a cornered cop protecting his witnesses. With a roar, he shoved the heavy oak table, sending glasses shattering to the floor. "Get out! Back door! Now!" he yelled, creating a sudden explosion of chaos that startled the entire bar. He grabbed a chair and hurled it toward the two men, buying a few precious seconds. The tavern erupted into a whirlwind of shouting and confusion as Liam grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her through the bewildered crowd toward the kitchen exit Kowalski had pointed out. The last thing they saw was the old detective standing his ground, a battered shield between them and the advancing darkness, his face set with a grim, final resolve. He was buying them a chance, paying a debt to a case he'd been forced to abandon long ago. They burst out of the back door and into a narrow, rain-slicked alley that smelled of garbage and river damp. The sounds of the bar fight faded behind them, replaced by the frantic beat of their own hearts and the slap of their shoes on the wet pavement. They could hear shouting from the alley's entrance, the heavy footsteps of the two men now in pursuit. The chase was on. They sprinted through a labyrinth of brick and steel, the city's industrial underbelly now a hunting ground. Headlights from a passing truck momentarily illuminated them, making them feel terrifyingly exposed. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant siren felt like it was for them. They were no longer just uncovering a story. They were living inside of it, running for their lives with a truth that was as heavy and as dangerous as a loaded gun. The desperate, frantic sprint through the rain-slicked Chicago alley was a blur of rusted fire escapes and overflowing dumpsters. Liam pulled Eleanor along, their footsteps echoing off the wet brick walls, the sounds of pursuit, a terrifyingly close drumbeat behind them. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the two dark figures, relentless and closing the distance. Ahead, the alley opened onto a wider, busier street. A city bus, its brakes hissing, was pulling away from the curb. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Liam propelled Eleanor toward the closing doors, and they tumbled inside, collapsing into a seat as the bus lurched forward into the flow of traffic. They were safe, for now, swallowed by the anonymity of the city, their hearts hammering against their ribs as the black sedan that had been chasing them receded into the night, a predator that had lost its prey in the urban jungle. As the bus rumbled through the city's glowing arteries, the immediate terror began to subside, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. They didn't speak of what happened to Kowalski. They didn't have to. They both knew the old detective had made a choice back in that tavern. He had thrown himself in the path of the wolves to give them a chance to escape. His final act was one of defiant atonement for a case he had been forced to abandon 12 years prior. The distant wail of sirens they now heard felt like a mournful tribute to his sacrifice. The weight of it settled upon them, a profound and terrible responsibility. They were no longer just seeking justice for Arthur Vance. They were now the custodians of Kowalski's final courageous stand. They had to see this through, not just for the dead, but for the man who had just given his life to protect the living and the truth they carried. They rode the bus to the end of the line, then took a cab to a nondescript motel on the city's forgotten fringe, paying in cash. The room was small, smelled of disinfectant, and offered a grim view of a flickering neon sign. Here, in this temporary haven, the full scope of their isolation became clear. They were fugitives, hunted by a powerful, ruthless network that had just demonstrated its willingness to use lethal force. Their evidence was legally inaccessible, their key witness was silenced, and their only ally was gone. But despair was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their one remaining hope was a ghost from the past, Pat O'Malley's widow, Mary, and the little black logbook Sully had told them about. It was a desperate, long-shot plan. They had to find her before Sterling's men, who were undoubtedly now sweeping up every loose end, realized she even existed. The mission had become a race for survival. The next morning, after a sleepless night, they found an address for Mary O'Malley in an old phone directory. She lived in a quiet, working-class suburb, a neighborhood of manicured lawns and identical houses that seemed a world away from the violence and conspiracy they were embroiled in. Approaching her felt like a delicate and dangerous operation. They couldn't simply knock on her door and announce that her husband was murdered by a political machine. The shock could be too much, and she might call the police, inadvertently exposing them. Liam felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Every passing car seemed to slow down. Every curtain that twitched in a window felt like a watchful eye. They were walking a tightrope, knowing that one wrong move could not only endanger themselves but could also shatter the fragile peace this woman had built for herself over 12 long years. It was Eleanor who walked up the concrete path to the front door, her face a mask of calm resolve. When Mary O'Malley, a woman with kind but tired eyes, answered, Eleanor didn't lead with the horrifying truth. Instead, she introduced herself as Arthur Vance's daughter, and spoke of the deep professional respect her father had for Pat. She talked about their shared belief in honesty and integrity, painting a picture of two good men who had been friends. She gently explained that they had found new information about the library project, information that suggested Pat's death was not the tragic accident everyone believed it to be. She spoke not as an accuser, but as a fellow traveler in grief, a daughter reaching out to a widow, united by a shared, unspoken loss. Her empathy was a key, slowly turning the lock on a door that had been sealed by sorrow for over a decade. Mary listened, her initial suspicion slowly melting away, replaced by a flicker of a long-extinguished hope. She invited them inside, to a home filled with memories of the man she had lost. As Eleanor recounted Sully's confession, Mary's eyes filled with tears, not of fresh grief, but of validation. She had never truly believed the official story. It had never squared with the careful, meticulous man her husband was. When Eleanor finally asked about an old journal, a logbook he might have given her, Mary's breath caught in her throat. She went to a hall closet and returned with a dusty cardboard box filled with her husband's personal effects. From beneath a stack of old photographs, she pulled a small, black, leather-bound notebook. "He told me it was just his work notes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He told me to keep it somewhere safe." She placed the book in Eleanor's hands, an act of profound trust, a final passing of the torch. Back in the suffocating confines of their motel room, they opened the logbook. The pages were filled with Pat O'Malley's precise, almost microscopic handwriting. It was a meticulous chronicle of corruption, far more damning than they could have ever imagined. He had recorded the serial numbers of the substandard steel I-beams, the dates of their installation, and the names of the apex foremen who signed off on them. He detailed his escalating arguments with Sterling's chief of staff, Costello, and documented his private meetings with Arthur Vance, where they compared their findings. But the final entry, dated November 14, 1998, the day he died, was the most chilling of all. It read, "Costello knows. He knows I have proof of the steel fraud. He wants to meet at the South Bridge site. Alone, I told Arthur. If I don't come back, the truth is in this book. God help me." It was a final, damning testament from a man walking to his own execution. They now possessed the one thing that could bypass Sterling's legal firewall: new, untainted evidence of a murder, written in the victim's own hand. But taking it to the authorities was a risk they couldn't afford. They didn't know how deep Sterling's influence ran. There was only one path left, the one Kowalski had opened for them before he died. Liam found the business card the old detective had given him, the one for Sarah Jenkins, the investigative reporter at the Chicago Tribune. It was their last, desperate gambit. They were about to hand over the story of a lifetime, a story that could either set them free or sign their death warrants. Liam made the call from a payphone, his voice low and urgent, arranging a clandestine meeting in a place where they could not be easily followed, the bustling chaos of Union Station. The meeting with Sarah Jenkins took place in a crowded food court, the noise and motion of thousands of commuters providing the perfect cover. Jenkins was sharp, her eyes missing nothing, her questions precise and relentless. Liam and Eleanor laid out the entire story, from the flaw in the blueprint to the secret room, from Vance's ledgers to O'Malley's logbook. They gave her copies of everything, including the final, haunting page of the journal. As Jenkins read it, her professional composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the human shock beneath. She understood immediately that this was more than a political scandal. It was a story of murder, a massive cover-up, and a ticking time bomb of faulty steel buried beneath one of the city's most beloved landmarks. She looked at them, her expression a mixture of awe and concern. "I'll run it," she said, "but you two need to disappear until it does." 2 days later, the Chicago Tribune hit the newsstands with a headline that screamed across the front page in massive, bold letters: "A tomb of lies, murder, corruption, and the secret bones of the Central Library." The story was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a meticulously detailed account of the entire conspiracy. It laid bare the $20 million embezzlement, the use of substandard steel, the murder of Patrick O'Malley, and the subsequent disappearance of Arthur Vance. Scanned images of O'Malley's logbook entries were printed alongside quotes from anonymous sources, painting an irrefutable picture of Richard Sterling's criminal enterprise. The story didn't just create a stir, it detonated a bomb in the heart of the city's political establishment. The public outcry was a tsunami of rage and betrayal. The narrative Sterling had controlled for over a decade was shattered in a single morning. The political fallout was swift and brutal. The judge who had issued the injunction was forced to recuse himself amidst calls for his impeachment. The state's attorney, now armed with irrefutable new evidence and overwhelming public pressure, immediately convened an emergency grand jury. Warrants were issued. Sterling's chief of staff, Costello, was arrested at the airport, attempting to flee on a private jet. And finally, news cameras swarmed the pristine lawns of Richard Sterling's suburban mansion as state police led the former mayor out in handcuffs. The image of the once untouchable titan, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, was broadcast across the nation. The empire built on a foundation of lies had crumbled, brought down not by an army, but by a flaw in a blueprint and the unyielding determination of those who refused to let the truth be buried. In the aftermath, Eleanor Vance stood in the library's grand rotunda. The city, as an act of public atonement, had commissioned a simple, elegant bronze plaque, now affixed to one of the main marble columns. It read, "In memory of Arthur Vance and Patrick O'Malley, men who built with truth and sacrificed everything to defend it." She traced the letters of her father's name, the cold metal warm beneath her fingertips. She had not found the man she had lost, but she had found something more profound: his justice, his honor, and the true meaning of his final brilliant design. The gaping wound of his absence, a void she had carried for 11 years, was finally filled with a sense of peace and immense pride. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had left her a legacy, a testament to the enduring power of integrity, built into the very bones of the city he loved. Liam Callahan's life was also irrevocably changed. Cleared of all professional complaints, he was now hailed as a national hero, an engineer who embodied the highest principles of his profession. He was offered a prestigious new role, heading a newly formed Civic Integrity Commission, tasked with overseeing all public works projects in Chicago, ensuring a scandal like the libraries could never happen again. He accepted, The simple moisture problem that had first brought him to the archives had been repaired, the building's physical flaw corrected. But the true resolution was deeper. The flaw in the blueprint, a deliberate imperfection left by a man of genius, had ultimately served its purpose. It had forced a reckoning, tearing down a corrupt structure to reveal the truth, allowing the city, like the library itself, to finally rest on a foundation that was honest, strong, and true. The city of Chicago did not tear down its library. Instead, it began to heal around it. The grand building on Michigan Avenue became something more than a repository of books. It transformed into a monument to a difficult, excavated truth. Tourists and locals would walk through its grand rotunda, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors, and look up at the soaring ceiling with a new understanding. They saw not just a masterpiece of design, but a silent witness, a structure that had held a dark secret in its very bones for over a decade. The library, once a symbol of Richard Sterling's triumphant legacy, was now a testament to Arthur Vance's enduring integrity. It was a place where stories were kept, and it had finally been allowed to tell its own most important and most tragic tale. Liam Callahan never looked at a blueprint the same way again. His new role as the head of the Civic Integrity Commission was less about calculating load-bearing capacities and more about measuring the moral integrity of the city's foundations. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a guardian, tasked with ensuring that the rot they had uncovered in the library's foundation would never again be allowed to fester in the dark corners of public works. He often thought of Arthur Vance, the man he had never met, but whose mind he had come to know intimately. He understood now that Vance's greatest design wasn't the library itself, but the elegant, fail-safe mechanism for truth he had embedded within it. Liam's work was a continuation of that design, a commitment to building a city as honest as the man who had inspired him. For Eleanor Vance, peace arrived not with a thunderclap of victory, but with the quiet stillness of a subtle dust. She would often visit the library, sitting on a bench in the main hall and simply watching the people come and go, their lives intersecting within the walls her father built. The bronze plaque was a comfort, a public acknowledgement of a private sacrifice, but her true closure came from a deeper understanding. Her father had not abandoned her. In his final, desperate act, he had entrusted her with his legacy, leaving behind a puzzle only she, with her intimate knowledge of his character, could help solve. She had spent 11 years searching for a ghost, only to find that he had never truly left. He was in the clean lines of the architecture, in the honesty of the steel, and in the enduring strength of the truth he had died to protect. The story of the flaw in the blueprint became a modern legend in Chicago, a cautionary tale about the arrogance of power and the persistence of truth. For 11 years, a carefully constructed lie had stood as the official history, its foundations seemingly unshakable. But the entire narrative, as solid as it appeared, was brought down by a single, almost imperceptible crack in its facade. It served as a stark reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes it is written by the meticulous, the patient, and the brave. The truth, like water seeping through concrete, will always find a way out. It may take a day, or it may take a decade, but it cannot be contained forever, especially when it is sealed within a tomb of its own making, waiting for the right key to unlock the door. Ultimately, Arthur Vance's final act was one of profound and defiant optimism. Faced with a corrupt system he could not defeat and a truth he could not speak aloud, he chose to place his faith not in people, but in principles. He believed in the immutable logic of mathematics and the honesty of a well-drawn line. The flaw he designed was a message in a bottle, a calculated imperfection thrown into the ocean of time, built on the conviction that someday another person who believed in those same principles would come along and read it. It was a testament to his belief that integrity, like a perfectly designed structure, has a permanence that outlasts the temporary reigns of powerful and deceitful men. He didn't just build a library. He built a fortress for the truth and trusted that it would endure. The cost of that truth, however, was paid in blood and sacrifice. Detective Kowalski's name was added to the city's memorial wall for fallen officers. His official cause of death listed as, quote, "in the line of duty." For those who knew the real story, the words were an understatement. He was a man who had spent his retirement drowning in the bitterness of a compromised system, only to find redemption in one final, defiant act of protection. He had stood as a shield, buying the precious time needed for the truth to escape into the world. His cynicism had been a scar, but his final act was one of pure, unshakable belief in the very justice he thought had abandoned him long ago. He had closed his own coldest case, and in doing so had finally found his peace. The trials of Richard Sterling and his co-conspirators dominated the news for months, a public exorcism of the city's demons. Costello, faced with O'Malley's logbook, confessed to everything in exchange for a lesser sentence, his testimony painting a chilling picture of greed and cold-blooded pragmatism. Sterling was convicted, his legacy dismantled, his name stripped from public buildings. He would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, a fallen king in a concrete kingdom. Yet as the legal proceedings unfolded, it became clear that the web of corruption was far more extensive than even Vance had realized, with threads leading to other projects, other departments, and other powerful figures who remained safely in the shadows. The monster they had exposed was only one head of a much larger hydra. This victory, as monumental as it was, felt less like an ending and more like the opening of a door to a much larger, darker room. The questions lingered, hanging in the air like the dust in Vance's secret chamber. How many other flaws lie hidden in the city's foundations? What other secrets are buried in the margins of old blueprints and redacted ledgers? And who else is still out there, protecting the legacy of a corrupt empire? The battle for the soul of the Chicago Central Library was won, but the war for the soul of the city itself had only just begun. And if you've been captivated by this story and want to see where these new, darker paths lead, make sure you're subscribed for what's coming next. The deepest secrets are often the ones hiding in plain sight. In the end, a building is more than just steel, glass, and concrete. It is a repository of human ambition, a testament to what we value, and a silent witness to the choices we make. Arthur Vance understood this better than anyone. He knew that a structure built on a foundation of lies, no matter how beautiful, is destined to crumble. In his final brilliant act of defiance, he ensured his masterpiece would stand not only as a monument to knowledge, but as an eternal reminder of a simple, unshakable principle. The most important structural element of any creation, whether it be a building or a society, is and always will be the truth.